All right, welcome back to this video. And today I'm going to talk about Ingroup bias, or why we tend to favor our own group. Full disclosure, this is the fifth time that I've tried to record this video. The four other times that I've tried, it's because I was trying to look for a way to be short, meaning to make it as entertaining as possible or useful as possible without giving up some of the information. Because I think that some information is crucial. Some information would be useful, but not necessarily. And since there's so many things to be said about the Ingroup bias, I always try to balance that information with, again, knowing and understanding that someone watching this might not want to spend 2 hours watching a video about the Ingroup bias. So those were the four. The fifth was basically a technical problem, but basically, again, trying to figure out a way to communicate what I wanted to say without giving up some of the important information. And also, full disclosure, the reason why there's a gap in between the last post and this one is because this is, again, a longer video. There's going to be double the space and or the length. And I also wanted to publish at the same time or in the same week the video about groupthink, which I'm recording at the same time, because without understanding groupthink, it's going to be complicated to fully understand Ingroup bias, and vice versa. Without understanding Ingroup bias, you might actually not understand the practical application of groupthink. So that's why one of the reasons why, again, there's a gap, and one of the reasons why I decided to record them all together. So let's start with these. And I always like to start with a starting point, and I sometimes might start with a definition, because I think that would be a good way for us to understand or to come to an agreement what we mean by, for example, Ingroup bias, etc. But I think that it's important for us to actually trace back, in this case, to our ancestors. So this is going to be looking from the lens of anthropology, and in particular, why we developed our language. So our language is the result of a combination of multiple areas in the brain interacting with each other. So what we understand language to be, meaning writing or listening or the capacity to produce sounds, is actually the combination of different portions of the area. It's not just one area of the brain that is in charge of language. And one of such areas is called the Broca area, located on the frontal lobe near the primary auditory area. And it's partly the cause of our evolutionary advantage. So if you remember from the other videos of our fist/brain, this will be the frontal cortex, prefrontal, this will be the parietal cortex, this will be the temporal lobe and the occipital lobe. So it would be around here, still frontal, a little bit below. And this area is actually in charge of planning of the speech process. So when we think about speaking, we have different components. We have the component of us thinking about what we're going to say that has to do with the interpretation of the language, then thinking about the sounds that we're going to make. And then the third would be basically the physicality of the movement, meaning how to move our mouth to produce those sounds. So the Broca area is in charge of planning all this process. And it is definitely connected with other areas because, again, it needs the connection between all these different parts that, are in charge of what I was just saying about processing the sounds and making sure that you move the muscles properly, thinking about the words that you have to say. So again, it's connected with other areas in charge of interpretation of language, also with areas dedicated to processing language and processing sounds. Those are located in the temporal lobe. If you remember parietal, this will be the temporal lobe. And with the motor cortex, which will be still in the frontal lobe, meaning near actually the parietal lobe, but kind of like next to it. That would be all the motor cortex. And in this case, this area will be in charge again on producing the physical or the physicality of the language, how to actually produce the sounds. Now, a group of primates developed these areas. We're not the only ones who actually have that capacity. Also, some changes on the larynx facilitated the creation of new sounds. So I think what's different from our primates companions in this case is that we're actually capable of producing new sounds, and because of that richness, because now those changes on the larynx allowed us to create more sounds, we could then codify or associate those sounds with different meanings. Like, for example, warning others from dangers, although this is not exclusively from us, like other primates can warn, but certain emotions conveyed with the sounds that we produce, and in certain situations, we're more prone for our Homo sapiens ancestors than they are from other primates. And obviously contributed to our success, meaning all of these changes as a species. Now, if we continue thinking about this evolution of the language evolved and it started to be used as a way of communicating more and more complex thoughts and tasks. As I said before, those changes now allow us to not only to create new sounds, but to actually put those sounds together. So the difference between one single sound that can be produced by a primate in our own sounds is that we have the capacity to put those two sounds or three sounds together, like syllables, and now all of a sudden can give a richer meaning. Although several primates, as I said before, have the capacity to communicate by using sounds, and even planning is not an exclusive domain of humans, our species increase their complexity. Again, it's not only about putting two different sounds like or ooh, it's just by putting together ooh and then forming something that actually make more sense and has a different meaning than just putting one sound next to the other sound. Our ancestors face incredible challenges. We always have discussed this just to survive, namely other animals, finding food, proper shelter, and the weather. Because of this enormous pressure they felt constantly, a lot of our early behaviors were developed to form a group, to be part of the group, and stay in the group. And I want to stop because we have discussed this at length. I think that we have explained that. But why is that important? Because again, we realized at some point that life was much, much easier if we have the collaboration of others, and it would be extremely hard to survive by our own self. So obviously, once we tasted that benefit of being with other people capable of doing different things like looking for shelter, other people dedicated to looking for food, other people to hunt, we realized and we experiment enormous differences and enormous benefits. So that's why a lot of our behavior were dedicated to not only to form a group, but, and this is a key distinction, to stay as part of the group. Most survival tasks became easier, and once a person belonged to that particular group. So as I said before, distribution of tasks was key for our not survival, because we could technically survive more or less living by ourselves. It's more that our lives would be extremely complicated, and our rate or success in terms of survival would be diminished if we try to do it by ourselves. Now, soon tribes were formed, and the capacity to survive included a new concern. It's other tribes. So again, we're no longer now fighting against other animals for the same resources. Now we're fighting against other tribes, other people like us who are trying to survive by using the same, and we have to compete. So now, if we think about that idea of forming tribes and now thinking about other tribes as something that we have to protect against, something that we ourselves have to protect against. Now we kind of understanding how different types evolve in a way, and different tribes evolve differently. That namely have to do with our capacity to understand our surroundings, and also our capacity to maximize the surroundings, meaning to realize the weather that we have, if we can get food. So the less stress we have about fighting those, the more we could evolve by thinking about other things, like maybe now started to think about how to become more efficient in terms of how to build things. But if we're constantly thinking about how to be looking for food against other people, definitely we're dedicating so much of our energy and our thought process to fighting others and to try to survive against others, that we're not evolving in the same way. And The next slide actually has to do with that point of evolution, because tribes evolved differently. Now, knowing our surroundings was key to our success in survival, definitely. Soon groups started to form, and some types were more successful at understanding and controlling their environment. So in this case, it's not necessarily that they were smarter. If you think about, it's not casual that most of these early tribes that were successful, and I'm going to give you one example of a big empire, in this case, Egypt. Most of these were next to rivers, in the case of Egypt, near the Niles, that allowed them, in this case, the Egyptians, to not only evolve in a natural way, but also to be able to focus on things that they couldn't focus before. Because now they don't have to be fighting and dedicating so much of their brain power into trying to fight other tribes, try to control the food, because the food is right there. They could actually focus more on how to fish in this case. They also have access to clean water that they could drink. They could also have, through the manipulation of water in the soil, dedicate a little bit less time in constructing and looking for shelter. And obviously, the way that they can do their shelters is more efficient now that they can manipulate their environment. So again, it's not necessarily that certain groups were smarter than the other ones. It's just that they have a maybe better environment, or more richer environment. And sometimes we're also more strategic, more numerous, and all of those different things have an enormous influence on how certain tribes evolve. Now, there were advantages to being part of certain groups. Definitely, as I said before, if you're part of Egypt at that moment, you most definitely would have a higher quality of life than if you live in a completely isolated tribe that didn't have access to many things, or if you were surrounded by groups that were competing for the same very limited resources. Now, some groups seem to be more successful, or at least in the past, even today, but let's focus on the past, creating a common culture. And every time I research on, for example, the development of different tribes, that idea of culture and how those, that idea of creating a common culture influence the evolution of a country, of an empire, keeps coming up. Again, that idea of the more clear who you are as a group, the better and the more beneficial, and the less amount of time you have to spend in other projects, the more you could evolve in certain other ways. People from those cultures tend to perceive themselves as part of a unit, and sometimes even as a unit that is more successful than the other ones. Now, importance of beliefs. Is that something that is truthful, or is something that, meaning, is important for us to understand that there is a distinction between being quote unquote the best than perceiving yourself or believing that you're the best. And in this case, you would have to create some sort of metrics, like what is it that you would consider as being the best? Well, if we're talking about like survival, and we're talking about evolution in terms of quality of life, well, then it would be clear, right? Like if you take two different types and you think, okay, what is the, for example, the death rate in people among 30 years old and older. So if you compare one tribe that is maybe like 10% versus the other one that is like 50%, then obviously in terms of survival, one is more successful than the other one. But a lot of these are also not based on real data. That perception of being the best is, or being worse, is actually just belief. And beliefs are very important. Now, beliefs gives us our sense of security. Without them, we feel lost. We have discussed that. Like that's one of the reasons why our behavior is developed to protect our beliefs, because again, it gives us our sense of security, not only about who we are, but by understanding our surroundings and creating beliefs about our surroundings, we're equating what we know to truth. And if all of a sudden we try to demolish one idea, or someone else try to demolish an idea or belief that we have, that equates to us not understanding our environment and feeling more lost. So now, beliefs versus truth. Beliefs, again, are not a synonym of truth. Believing things are just believing things, but rather perceptions of reality. But again, we have to balance that. Yes, that true, because it's true that beliefs are not true, but we also have to balance that with the reality that beliefs gives us our sense of security. So again, we substitute truth with belief because there are a lot of things that we cannot know, but we still need to have a sense that we understand what's happening. So that is where beliefs come in handy because it gives us certain explanations on certain realities, even if we don't understand, and especially when we don't understand the reasons behind those. Now, it is really important to protect our perception of reality, meaning our beliefs, because without it, we cannot make sense of the world we live in. The other side of the coin, meaning the other side of, yes, it is important, is to obsess about those beliefs. And why is that a negative? Is because that can lead to superstition-based behaviors and have possible negative consequences. And I'm going to name one. This is a controversial one, but we have to address that. There are certain religions, for example, that do not accept medical treatments that would be beneficial for a person. So obviously that will be an example of a superstition-based belief because it's not based on reality, but based on a belief that can actually harm a person's health. Now, obviously, that idea of belief, we all have beliefs. We all believe in certain things, but why do we have different beliefs? But I think even more important, where are those beliefs created? Is there such a thing as a portion of the brain that is in charge of creating beliefs? And it turns out that kind of. In fact, our beliefs, and I'm going to talk from a neuroscience point of view, in a 2008 study conducted by Sam Harris and collaborators on the changes in the brain produced by statements of beliefs, disbelief, and uncertainty, measured using fMRI, they concluded that certain areas of the brain are activated when the person is convinced that a statement is either to be true or not to be true, or a person just didn't really care or didn't know. Now, to summarize, in this study, people were given a series of statements that were the same for everyone, but some statements some people believed to be true. The same statement would not believe to be true, but another group of people. And some people would be like, I don't really know, but I don't really care. So that would be the uncertainty. And they actually measure, and they realize that when a person believes a statement to be true, again, regardless of that statement to be actually true or not, but when the person believes that statement to be true, a different portion of the brain will be highlighted than when the person read the statement and thought that the statement was actually not true. And in fact, the only thing that they have in common is that the same portions of the brain will be highlighted when the person thought that to be true. Again, the statements didn't change. What it changed is the interpretation of the statements, and everyone who thought something to be true will highlight the same portions of the brain. So that is, he or she believes the statement to be true, and one of these particular portions of the brain will be the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, or VMPFC. So if you're curious, I'm going to give you the names just in case you want to research them. So with the brain first, so if we're talking about that these will be the prefrontal cortex, that will be kind of like right here underneath. And it's called the ventromedial, is ventro meaning towards the vientre, in this case, the stomach, and medial being in the middle, prefrontal cortex. Now, when a person actually doesn't believe a statement or believes that a statement is not true, a different portion of the brain or different portions of the brain were actually activated. And it's actually very telling. And I'm going to give you, again, just the name so you can research them if you want. So they're all, just keep in mind, they're all in the prefrontal and frontal area or frontal cortex. The left inferior frontal gyrus or gyros, depending on where you live in, the anterior insula, and this is a bilateral, that means that it exists in both sides. The dorsal anterior cingulate, and that is extending to the superior frontal gyrus, and in the superior parietal lobe, that means in the upper part of the parietal lobe. Now, as you can see, there are different portions of the brain activated when a person read a statement and that person believed that statement not to be true. Again, the difference was not the statement, the difference was the interpretation of the statement, and that confirms that depending on how you read something, or if you think that something to be true or not to be true, different portions of the brain are going to be highlighted. Now that we kind of understand how the neuroscience explains different type of beliefs, or explains what happens in our brain when we understand something to be true and when we think that something not to be true, why do we have different sets of beliefs? Like, why do we have different portions of the brain that are activated depending on how we interpret things to be either truth or not truth? Why do we have that? Well, that actually you have to go to a more psychological explanation, because we can classify beliefs into two types of beliefs. One type is experience-based beliefs, and the other one group-based beliefs. So experience-based beliefs are those that we, meaning the individual, have experience with, like something that has happened to us, and then we can see, although there's some portion of interpretation, and that has to do with our heuristics and our prior experience to that particular event and how we manage to interpret that. The fact is that those happen when we experience directly something. Yes, there's an interpretation, and as we discussed, there are biases there, and then the way that we perceive things can also alter depending from one person to another person. But what I wanted to say is that there's a different type of category of beliefs based on the group. Now, sometimes we adopt other beliefs based on the group or groups who are part of it. But the reason is because sometimes we either don't have or haven't thought about certain things through, meaning we haven't had the time to make our minds about certain subjects. And then we are part of a group that part of that group already have thought through those things. And then because we want to be part of the group, we tend to adopt that. And sometimes we actually have made our mind, or we already have thought through those particular subjects. But since we don't want to fight against the group, we tend to adopt the thought of the group. And that is called the groupthink. And the groupthink is, again, once we substitute, once we have substituted our individual thinking process or thought process with the thought process of the group. And again, the explanations would be, one, probably is because we haven't thought through certain things. And the second one, or the second reason, would be when we have thought through certain things, but we are not so attached to that idea. And because we don't want to fight against the group, because we benefit from the group, we adopt the groupthink or the thought process of the group. Now, these beliefs tend to give us comfort, and they're also protected by the group. So these share the same similarities with you having a thought. Obviously, a belief will give you a certain sense of comfort, because a belief basically covers an understanding on why things are the way they are. So once you don't have something clear and you adjust to the group, or in this case, the groupthink, what you're doing is basically covering that knowledge that you don't have by adopting the knowledge of the group. But again, it will give you comfort. It will give you that sense of understanding your surroundings. And more importantly, in this case, is not only that you are going to protect this thought process or this belief, is that you're going to be protected by, or help being protected by, the entire group. So in the case of Ingroup bias, and now is when I'm going to give you a definition, this is a preference in treatment from a group or individuals who belong to a group. perception of the group and or the individuals from that group as somehow better or more deserving than others. So if you think about everything that I have said, everything has a reason. The reason is that we live in an uncertainty place where we have to figure out a lot of the things that we encounter, and then sometimes we can figure out by ourselves, and sometimes we need the help of other people. Sometimes other people cover that, and sometimes people from that group think differently than we are. But since we're being benefited by the group, we again tend to protect the beliefs of the group or adopt the group think or adopt the belief of the group because we don't want to go against the group. So that idea of belonging to a group is so powerful because we know, we experience what it is to be alone. We experience what it is to not be part of the group and try to survive in by ourselves. That we will do whatever. That's why you see so many people changing their minds. And I'm talking about politics. I'm talking about sports. I'm talking about anything in which a large group of people, it's just a group of people, have a thought, and then within a couple of years, they seem to flip-flop or change towards the other side and then look at the same thing from another perspective, and a perspective that seems contradictory to the first belief that they have. The explanation is very simple. Part of the group evolved in a way, and then a lot of the people didn't want to fight against the group because that meant that they might be expelled from the group. So that's one of the reasons why, again, a lot of these behaviors are, as we said before, to stay in part of the group, and a lot of the people will not fight against the group. Now, since we have our sense of security based on those beliefs, and the groups have a set of beliefs that will give us, again, even more sense of security, that sense of community, of understanding our surroundings, or feeling protected. What we want is to get more people that are like us in the world and less people who are not like us in the world. That is part of our bias, right? So we're more focused on, and in this case, it has to do a lot to do with confirmation bias, which is basically looking for people who will express the same beliefs, who have the same values, etc., because that would make me feel that I'm right. That would make me feel doubt less on my own beliefs and the beliefs of the groups. And that's why we tend to prefer or give preference to people who we perceive are part of our quote unquote group. Now, what a group means will be defined depending on the lens that you're looking at. Like, you can be looking at a person from your group as from a perspective of religion. You're sharing certain values from certain people from certain religions, then more than you share with people from completely opposite religions, meaning opposite in beliefs. But you can also look at the same people from the lens of race. And unfortunately, racism has been an important part of, I think, everybody's history. The United States is not exempt from that, obviously. We can also look at things from the lens of gender in both sides. You can look from the lens of being a man and what that means, or being a woman and what that means. So any preference to people that you perceive that are part of your group, whatever you are looking as a group at that particular moment, that is called in-group bias. Now, I thought that in-group bias without groupthink, it would be impossible. But again, I will dedicate a different video to groupthink. But I wanted to highlight why groupthink and in-group bias are related. And I wanted to express this from a neuroscience point of view, as I always try to do. And I'm going to start with the mirror neurons and why mirror neurons are so important. So if you don't know, mirror neurons were first discovered by a group of scientists led by an Italian neuroscientist or neurologist, called Dr. Giacomo Rizzolatti. And it seemed that they, meaning the neurons that they were investigated, facilitated the learning acquisition, especially in language. So they look at the brains, first of primates, I think, and then on humans, and they realize that there are a group of neurons that are activated once we see other people. For example, in this case, once we see other people speaking. And that actually explains, for example, why babies look at the mouth constantly when they're little, and they're trying to mimic when they see other people speaking. They're trying their best to actually communicate with the other person, and they do it by copying the sounds. Now, the idea that we have of mirror neurons, or that some people have about mirror neurons, is that it's only applicable to language. It's not necessarily true, because, for example, even the accent that you have, whether you are in the US or you are in the UK, you probably would experience a different accent if you go to a different country, and where the accent, even if it's the same language, you will realize that people speak differently. Or even if you are in the United States and you go from the Northeast to the Southwest, you are going to realize that that is completely different, and then it's going to even sound foreign to you. Now, as you can see, mirror language doesn't necessarily have to do just with the capacity to produce sound. It has to do with the capacity to mimic others, even when that is how to produce the sound and how the cadence, for example. And also, mirror neurons are used as a way to mimic other parts that are not related to language, namely the way that we think, even the way that we feel about certain things. Now, mirror neurons contribute to the way in which we interact with others and to our belonging to a group. How? Because this should be a proof that even when babies are born, they are hearing certain things, are hearing the cadence, meaning the accent of a particular person, people around that baby. He's also looking at how to produce sounds, how to move his mouth or her mouth to mimic the other person. And that should be a reflection on how the baby is trying to fit in. How the baby is trying to actually be part of a group? How is that baby at a natural way is developing these skills just to fit in within a group of people? Now, groupthink and Ingroup bias. So family is the first source of group identity. And it is impossible to separate groupthink and in-group bias without talking about identity, because identity is the core idea in which we base the group, not only the groupthink, but the in-group bias. So without understanding what is our group, without understanding what do we give an identity as this is our group, we don't have such group. We have to create that sense of identity first. So that is started as younger kids or as babies, when we start looking at our families. But what I mean by families is not necessarily your parents. It could be like your grandparents, and it could also be like foster care, whatever concept you have of family as a unit, meaning as a part of your unit, or the first group that you're exposed to. That is what influences first in your creation of identity and the creation of a group. And this is multifaceted. That means that it's not only about one single thing. In it influences the socioeconomic, the identity in terms of race, religion, etc. So as you can see, the family is the first exposure to a group of people, the most direct contact that you're going to have when you grow up. And that is what's creating the first concept of what a group is, or what an identity is. And with that concept, or with those concepts, we go to the world, and then we continue to form groups based on what we learned in our first exposure. Now, socioeconomics is the first thing that I wanted to highlight, and how that has an influence in beliefs. And again, look at it from the lens of family, because that's the first exposure that you have. But at the same time, as you grow as an adult, look at it as a way to expand that knowledge of socioeconomics into everything. How that affects you as a teenager, as an adult, the relationships that you have with other people. And I actually highlighted one basic research that the American Psychology Association established, which I thought it was very interesting, because it actually exposes the things that I wanted to communicate much better. And according to the American Psychological Association, socioeconomic status is a reliable predictor of a vast array of outcomes. So is a predictor, is not something that it might suggest that something else will happen. It's actually a reliable predictor. That means that you can actually predict with high accuracy how the socioeconomics will create certain type of behaviors, certain type of outcomes in terms of health, etc. And it is important to stop right there because, yes, I'm not saying that that is definitely a guarantee. When we talk about predictor, it's not a 100%. It's in terms of probability. It's like, well, maybe the likelihood of you becoming this person would be a 90% or 70%, which is still super high. So yes, there's always these outliers that grew up in very poor conditions and they did great. And then people sometimes use these outliers as a way to justify, you see, if you can, these other people can. When in reality, the fact that 70%, 80%, or 90% did not succeed should actually tell you more than that 10% that actually did, because it's actually a reflection on how these 10% are, again, exceptional. And yes, technically, there will be a possibility, but not everyone can actually have access to that. For example, maybe the person was extremely intelligent. Maybe this person met the right teachers. So not everyone has the same opportunities. So that's why it is important for us to build this concept of socioeconomics with a bias, or try to avoid as many biases as possible. So again, it's a reliable predictor of a vast array of outcomes as examples, health, academic skills, and it says a lower socioeconomic status is linked to poor cognitive development, language, memory, socio-emotional processing. So when I talk about socioeconomics, it's very difficult to talk about socioeconomics because this is also a multifaceted in itself. It's not only that you're born in a place and then you're just related to your family. It affects also the way that you live. Like, for example, if you live in a poor neighborhood, and then most of these people couldn't afford, for example, in this here, for example, in the United States, if they couldn't afford, most people in that neighborhood couldn't afford to go to college. So you tend to normalize certain behaviors, like, for example, that, college might not be an important thing. And I'm not saying that it's necessarily an important thing. I'm not even saying that it's necessary. I'm just saying that it establishes certain beliefs and certain behaviors based on the things that you see. Now, also, poor schools, meaning schools in poor neighborhoods, tend to be under-resourced, and people who live there tend to live in similar conditions within each other. This alone furthers the differences between poor people and richer people. Like, for example, living around higher concentration of people with lower cognitive development, which is one of the conclusions that they make, creates a sense of normalcy, meaning that person not having the capacity to read is not as bad, right? Because, I've known plenty of people who have the same reading progress. Like, maybe the person is 12 years old, but still has the capacity of a 7-year-old in terms of reading. But I know so many people that I think that somehow that is normal. Now, if you flip it and you actually look at from the other side, what happens to people who live in a richer environment, people who live in an environment that is capable of providing those kids with more visits to the museums, traveling to other cultures, experiencing other cuisines? Obviously, the experience of those people are a little bit richer, and obviously their development, their cognitive development can actually be higher. So again, we have to pay attention within those statements, and also without being biased, because you might have bias in both sides. Like, let me actually address it for you. If you're in a right wing and you say, well, I believe in people merits or people efforts. So those people who don't succeed is because they couldn't, because there are plenty of examples of people who grew up in poor environments and made it. Again, that is a biased thought, because if you think about it, just because a few people did, that doesn't mean that everyone can. And in fact, the fact that the majority of people could not succeed at the same rate as all the group of people should actually tell you that that is actually a bad system. On the other hand, when you talk about someone who is more on the left, and especially more in education, they might think, well, that is because of poor statistics that actually doesn't reflect reality. Well, that is also a bias, because you're actually thinking that the reason why these people are scored lower in terms of cognitive is because of the test or the way that you grade. And in fact, that could be true. There could be a poor testing process. It could be that the things that you're measuring are not correct. But it's also kind of like ignoring the fact that people who don't grow up with richer environment, and by rich, I don't mean literally more money, I mean richer experiences, like having access to cultural experiences or traveling to other places, as I was saying before, they're definitely not going to develop certain skills that other people will. It's like thinking about training, like physically training in one aspect and ignoring the other one. Like, for example, and I know that this is a stupid example, but maybe it's going to be a little bit more clear. It's like training your biceps and ignoring your legs and thinking that, well, I'm fully developed. Well, you didn't work on your legs. So you cannot expect to be fully developed. And look at people, and people look at you as someone who has developed muscles in your legs if you haven't actually taken the time, and vice versa. So it is important for us to not ignore the fact, or again, to not come to that idea of socioeconomics and the consequences with bias, to not put our thoughts in it, but instead to just understand that, again, having more opportunities, having the possibilities of having access to a richer culture will give you definitely advantages in terms of how to not only perceive the world, but how to interpret certain things and how to develop as a human being. Then if you don't have that, again, doesn't mean that it's a guarantee. If we flip it and we talk about people who grew up in a rich environment, and now, yes, I mean a rich person, meaning a rich environment, meaning a rich neighborhood. Yes, you may have access to all of that, but if your parents are a disaster, they don't communicate with you efficiently, you might actually have other things that people with poor, and yes, I mean poor economics in terms of money, poor people did have access. And I'm talking about into extremes, how people sometimes in poor environments have better family ties and they can help each other. And those are the people who tend to succeed. And how people, even if they're rich and they have plenty of opportunities, because they don't have a good family ties, or they don't have a good relationship with their families, or they don't develop certain social skills, they can actually become the opposite. They can actually end up in a really poor state of life. In this case, again, there's no guarantee that one thing is going to lead towards the other one. We're talking about probabilities, and it is important to look at from that perspective and not from the perspective of guarantee. Now, the second thing that I wanted to discuss is that idea of identity and culture. Now, when we talk about identity and culture, identity itself is defined depending on the place that you live in. Like, it's different from any country to another country. Like, each culture promotes certain behaviors, like respect for the elders, importance of respecting personal space, culture of work. Now, for example, I'm going to give you an example that it's dear to me. When I came here to the United States, I used to do the same thing that I do, for example, in Spain. Like, when I was introduced to a female, I would just do 2 kisses. When I was introduced to a man, it would be like hand or hug. Simple. So some people were taken aback, like, oh, that's too much. And I understand that now, but obviously I didn't grow up that way. And in fact, if a female, for example, would have extended her hand, I would take that as very insulting, because it's like, for me, it would be as if I tell you, no, stay away. I don't want to talk to you. Because that's how people who grew up in that environment, meaning for example, in Spain, would interpret those signs. So again, that is a cultural aspect, but it's just an example. But again, if we're talking about even that concept of identity, if you took to a Spaniard, if you ask to a Spaniard, like, where are they from? They might tell you from Spain, or they might ask you, or they might even tell you the region of Spain. One thing that is new, for example, to me when I came here to the United States was new, is when I asked someone where are they from, and then they might say, "Well, I'm from, I don't know, from North Carolina, but I'm Dominican." And then when I ask, "Oh, were you born?" He said, "No, my parents are Dominican." That idea of having a double identity is very nuanced of the United States. I don't think a lot of people in the rest of the world use that double identity. And in fact, if you tell someone in Spain that you are half Asian because your parents are Asian, or half Chinese, to be more precise, and they ask you where you're from, and then you say, "Well, I'm from New York, but I'm half Asian," they will say, "Well, I don't care about who your parents are from." Like, they would interpret that you are exhibiting elements of the culture that you grew up in, not the elements of the culture that your parents are from. Yes, granted that in your case, you grew up maybe speaking a different language. Yes, you might have certain things that you share in common with other people who are of Asian descent, like, for example, other Chinese American, and that is true. But if you compare yourself with other people, again, for example, in Spain, you would realize that you probably have more in common with the people in the US than you imagine. So I know that you probably think, well, yes, but I'm different because I grew up in a culture that spoke, for example, Mandarin, and then we have certain concepts about family that most people in my environment don't have, and that is true. But for example, your take, for example, in terms of money and how you see businesses, probably is going to be very different than someone who grew up in Spain. So again, the reason why I'm telling you this is because I want you to reflect on that idea of identity and how it is important to not equate your idea of identity with the idea of identity that other people have, or the basic or general idea of identity, because that also varies from country to country. Now, it is important to be part of a group, but you have to be careful of not going to the opposite extreme of identity, in which you identify and substitute your sense of individuality by including the identity of the group. Like, for example, if you identify as if you say, for example, you are an African American, or you're black, right? That is true. That is a statement of truth. You are black because you're black. That is true. There's nothing for and against. It's just a statement of how your body, exhibits a darker skin. That's it. There's nothing else. Now, the problem is when you start saying, as a person of blank group, I believe in such, because you're saying that first, that you as a person, you're an individual, think the same as other people who are part of that group. And yes, you might think that you share certain realities with other people with the same group. But that is actually not true. It's your experience, and it might be even the experience of the majority of people. But you're expressing a thought that is individual, but you're putting it in a context that sounds like as an individual, as a part of a group. So it is important, again, for us to distinguish what is a statement of truth and what is a statement of belief. And in this case, statements of truth would be to say, as a person, I identify as a person, as a black person, because you are black. That's it. That is a statement of truth. Now, as a person of a group, I believe such, that is not a statement of truth. That is a statement of belief. And then that is a statement that you believe, and everyone in that category, on that group, think the same way. It's also a belief. It's not true that everyone in the same group that you have put yourself into believe the same thing. It's just that you think that a lot of people think that way. Now, the more you identify with a group, the more you tend to behave like the group. And that is part of the groupthink. Again, that substitution of your individual thought process or your individual thinking process by the thinking process or the thought process of the group. That's called groupthink. The more you identify, again, with the group, the more you tend to behave like the group. Identity is more than just about the country that you live in. As I said before, different concept of identity. You are going to encounter a different concept of identity if you're talking about identity in Spain than you are talking about identity in the United States. Now, especially in a multicultural society like the United States versus a monocultural like Spain, that is going to be less and less true, because it's true that even in Spain, which you still don't find a lot of diversity, obviously with mobility, and especially from North African countries that come to Spain and have come, and even some people who have lived there for centuries, that is less and less true. But as of right now, comparatively, obviously, the United States is a way more multicultural than Spain. Now, even then, people find, even in Spain, even in monocultural countries, you encounter people that can find ways to differentiate themselves from the rest. Like, for example, different communities there, I don't know if you know this, different cultures, like, for example, Catalonia and País Vasco, namely the biggest differentiators in Spain, because they have the belief that they are different, or they want to separate from the rest of the country because they believe that they're different, to the point that, for example, in the case of País Vasco, they believe that they have a different, even a different race, that they are somehow different. Some people who actually want to separate don't believe that they're a different race, but I'm exposing extreme example of what that can lead to the point that, some people actually believe. And if you're curious about that, there's a whole debate about how the RH, meaning the blood group, it was different for people in País Vasco. Now, as you can see, even in monocultural countries, you can find examples of people who can actually, or find themselves as different from the rest. Now, religion and beliefs. Religions is another source of identity and another source of creation of groups. Now, religions try to give explanations to the most important questions, like, for example, who are we, where do we come from, and where do we go after we die? Now, the answers to those questions vary with the religious beliefs. Like, it's different from a Buddhist than it is to a Christian. And even within Christianity, you would find completely extreme and opposite beliefs, some being more moderate than others. And then obviously the way that you are going to respond to certain beliefs being challenged is going to be different. So the more attached you are to certain ideas, the more extreme you are to certain ideas, the more difficult will be for you to hear opposing points of view. Now, variations in the degree to which people are indoctrinated, for example, more religious societies versus more secular societies, will influence the way in which those people will respond to challenges to those beliefs. As I said before, if you have a particular point of view in terms of gay marriage, for example, that will be very different in a more secular society than it is to a deeply religious society. And that is kind of like a way for us to understand how that can have an influence on not only your concept of identity, but how can that affect other people and how can that affect other groups. Now, religions, as I said before, gives a sense of comfort that benefits most believers. And in this case, it's not only about certain realities and how we interpret our or how we interpret our environment, but how we give explanations to deeper questions that, again, give meaning to not only our life, but what we interpret the afterlife to be. So I wanted to create a different section because precisely that, because these beliefs are so deeply ingrained in our society and they're so important to us that it's very difficult to compare to any other belief. Again, I would say religion's beliefs would be probably the most difficult beliefs in which you can interact with someone. So if you have a different sets of beliefs in terms of religions, and by different I mean even opposites, it's going to be very difficult for you to try to come with an understanding to the other person, unless that you both are moderate. But again, you wouldn't have that opposite point of view. You would be more in the middle. Now, with everything that I have discussed, that idea of socioeconomics and how you are brought up, the idea of religion, the identity and culture, you create your sense of who you are as an individual, but also as a group. And you create that idea of us, meaning that idea of the group. Who are you, right? As a group, not as an individual. And there's this idea of then us versus them that starts coming out, especially when you're confronted with something that is dear to you, something that you want to protect, especially in particular what I was just discussing about religion. Now, the downside of belonging to a group is clear, right? Taken to an extreme, we tend to lose ourselves in the group's identity. Because of that, part of our behavior is designed to protect the well-being and beliefs of the group. As I said before, we have mentioned that over and over again, that idea of understanding our surroundings, being benefited by the beliefs of the group, and that giving us a sense of comfort that we understand what's going on. It's so important that we need to protect it. But not only that we need to protect it, is that we have the encouragement of other people who are like us to protect the same belief. So again, this is not an individual belief that we can generate a lot of resistance. This is a belief that we're going to share the resistance with other people. So we tend to be even more resistant than individual beliefs because, again, we're part of a group and we still want to be part of the group. There's similarities with doubting yourself. Like, for example, we doubt the beliefs of the group, we feel lost and it increases that sense of anxiety, like not understanding our surroundings, not knowing what's going on. And if I doubt of this belief, what other things am I wrong about? So obviously no one wants to go to that spiral, descending spiral on disbelief or not understanding what's going on, because that, again, as I said before, creates a lot of anxiety. And then when the individual, again, doubts the validity of the group, it is as if the person wouldn't understand his or her surroundings. And also having to confront the group is also an important portion. So let's say that you're kind of convinced that your beliefs are different from the beliefs of a group that you're part of. Then is the second challenge, is how do you even confront that idea? How do you bring it up to the group? So you would actually try to convince yourself that you might be wrong because the people who are giving you so much are expressing opposite views. So obviously you don't want to confront the group. You don't want to lose the benefit of being part of the group. So again, having to confront the group you're part of without the support of any other group leaves you with a sense of fear of not being protected by any group. So if you're part of a group, as I said before, and you have a belief that is opposing, unless you have the certainty that you're going to be equally protected by a different group, your first fear is going to be, all right, I came to the realization that that is not true, that these people are wrong, the group that I'm part of is wrong in that regard, but what if I fight with them? What if I'm not part of the group? What am I going to do next? So all the network that I have built, all the things that I have in common with other people, all of a sudden that will disappear. So we tend to see others as different and sometimes as less than us in certain aspects. Once we have created that idea of us and who we are and we stick to the group, we tend to see others as different and sometimes as less than us in certain aspects. Like, for example, if you're from a particular political group or you have a particular political point of view or a religion, and especially for those who are a little bit more extreme, it's very difficult for you to come to an understanding again with someone who is constantly, even not telling you, but showing you that you are quote unquote wrong, because it will make you doubt on yourself, and you don't want to do that. So again, you would find it. You would fight it. You would try to make sure that you either demolish that person's idea or you will ignore that person altogether. So we tend not to feel as bad when they suffer. We tend not to pay so much attention if that person feels anything, because we actually don't think of that person as the same as us. And on the flip side, we tend to reward people who are like us. I kind of introduced that idea before, and this is how confirmation bias, yes, again, confirmation bias is showing the influence that it has in this particular bias. Because what do you want at the end from this Ingroup bias is to create an environment in which you're surrounded by more people who are like you. You want more of you in the world and less of other people in the world. So basically, you want to confirm your ideas through other people expressing the same beliefs, the same ideas as you do. So again, that is the influence of confirmation bias in this particular idea, and that's why a combination of both extremes, that we don't tend to care about people who we feel that are not part of our group, and the opposite, meaning we tend to focus more on people who are like us, is what creates that difference in that preference of group or in-group bias that makes us to focus more on people who are like us and giving them the resources that we perceive that they deserve, rather than these other people that we perceive that they're not like us, they're going to ruin everything for us, and they're not people that we want to even get around, have around. Now, possible solutions, as I always try to do at the end, I try to give certain solutions. This is a tough one because we have the protection of a belief by the group, and that makes it way harder to change a belief. It's very, very difficult for us to change a belief if not only we're protecting that belief, but we're also being surrounded by people who have the same belief, and they're constantly saying, yeah, you're right, these people are wrong, etc. Now, things that have been proven effective include exposing a person to a different group with different beliefs from a neutral, non-confrontational perspective. Now, this has two different consequences. One is to see the reality of how other people think. That is good. But also to address the problem that we were talking about a second ago, in which I was saying that one of the main problems that people face once they realize that they have a different belief from the group that they are part of is that they don't want to be alone. They don't want to be they don't want to be losing everything. And even if they jump to a different group, they want to have the certainty of that they are going to have benefits of belonging to a group. So exposing a person with a particular extreme belief to people or groups of people who have an opposite point of view not only will highlight those points of view, will also show that there's a possibility of believing that thing and being part of a group, and that group can also bring benefits to that person. So another thing is addressing a person's concern about a particular belief and never ignoring their concerns, even and especially when those concerns seem irrational. Now, one common mistake that I feel like I've seen a lot in anti-bias trainings is that they tend to think, well, you're wrong, and I'm going to tell you why. And that's like, no, you have to address those people's concern, especially. And yes, you might actually think that person is irrational. In fact, it might be irrational, and the person might be objectively wrong. But you cannot ignore that, because until you address that concern, until you focus on that concern, the person would not have the chance to change, because the person is still holding to that belief, because that belief gives a sense of comfort, a sense of security. So again, substituting that with something else, with that explanation, is just not going to happen. And yes, even when you do that work, you're going to encounter people who believe certain things and they want to still be irrational. Then there are people who you will not be able to help, unfortunately. But at least if you're going to be efficient, if you are going to try to maximize the way in which you're going to address a particular problem, in particular, if you are in a business environment in which you have different thoughts, different beliefs that can collide at some point, you have to address people's concern. Again, even if, and especially if you find those concerns to be irrational, those beliefs to be irrational. Now, an indirect way to to teach or to help people with this particular bias would be to teach a person. Again, we're not addressing a group when we're talking about solutions. We're always talking about how to address individuals. Even if you're doing in a group session, you still want to see those particular beliefs showing up before giving a solution. So an indirect way would be to teach a person, or in this case, if it's in a group, logic and reasoning. Like in the case of Professor Dunning. If you remember when I talked in the video of the Dunning-Kruger effect, one of the ways in which people improve their perception of themselves and how they grade themselves would be by teaching a person logic and reasoning. That doesn't mean that you're going to be attacking a belief. In fact, you're just going to ignore beliefs in anything. You're just going to explain logic statements. You're going to explain what logic is and how to reason. Math can be beneficial, but I find logic and reasoning to be a little bit more efficient. Yes, there's some logic and reasoning, in math problems, but focusing more from a language point of view would be more beneficial than introducing something that already might create that sense of rejection. Like the person might not feel comfortable by solving mathematical problems, even if that can actually help them. So again, an indirect way would be to teach a person logic and reasoning, like in the case of Professor Dunning. Now, as I always say, everything that I'm telling you, you can question, you should question, and this is not to be used against someone. This is something for a tool for self-reflection. However, in the case of Ingroup bias, this is the type of thing that you're going to probably going to be addressing when you are in a group. Like, for example, when you're talking about a company, an organization of any type, an association. It is important for you to understand that when you do that, you also want to pay attention to individual responses and individual differences. And always try to approach these from a self-reflecting point of view, meaning teach these as a way for other people to reflect on how to proceed rather than force feed certain things. And yes, sometimes you have to be more aggressive about certain subjects, and you have to be assertive in the way that if a person is being irrational and challenging you, for example, if you're in charge of, and if you're an HR person, for example, you're being challenged by someone and challenge you in something that is logical. You don't have to accept that. You don't necessarily have to agree with that person. My point was try not to confront that person's belief by saying directly that person is wrong and I'm going to show you why, but rather trying to give the person as many chances as possible to see certain different perspectives before you give up and say, all right, you're wrong and this is why. So as usual, I hope that this is useful, that at least this is informative. Enjoy the video. Thank you so much for watching, and I see you in the next one. Thank you.